Ahem. This podcast is brought to you by the Almanac and Scientific Canada. It was recorded on the traditional territories shared between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. Enjoy. I feel like I just butchered that again, even though
That's close enough.
we just had the conversation. Okay.
My research on light adaptation in the fish right now.
I'm sitting in a kiddie pool, actually. It's quite nice,
Oh, that would be great.
but it's
man.
not very professional, as they say. Previously on Random Walk. Sarah, you're coming to ComSciCon Canada.
Yes, I am virtually.
You're in Winnipeg, and what do you study?
So I am doing my PhD in breastfeeding research. So I study breast milk and the composition of breast milk and how it impacts babies' growth and development. The area that I'm focusing on is cognitive development and behavior. So how does breastfeeding and breast milk affect how the baby behaves as they grow up? I would say I started in science being more interested in policy development. So I've always had a real passion for kind of supporting child and youth health. I think that if we're going to do anything to support health, it's like the most meaningful and the best type of investment you can make is to start young, because that's where you're going to get the largest gains. And so I was really interested in kind of maybe doing some government work or kind of being more of an advocate for really healthy policies. And so that's always been kind of part of my interest. The PhD is I'm definitely interested in science and research. I really love communicating. And as a researcher, you don't always, you get to really choose what you want to engage in, but you don't always get all of those opportunities if you have to be grant writing for 80% of your time. And so I've really gravitated towards exploring more about what career options could look like in science communication after grad school. I would say, I'm not sure what it's gonna look like yet. But
Just know you want to be communicating something, somehow.
yeah, I want to communicate something. Hopefully I'll figure it out in the next 3 years.
That's interesting. I don't normally talk to people who say science policy was their driving force.
I think that when you're interested in kind of human health and behavior, a good way to kind of actually see change, if it works well, if it aligns with what the current government wants, is to be in policy, because you can, for example, like advocate for implementing some kind of behavior program in a daycare that in 3 years you see these kids are doing way better than they would have otherwise. And so I feel like there's these really tangible outputs where you can see benefit and you can see change. It definitely takes a long time, but I like the bridge between like the implementation of something that could be really meaningful. The reason I really would love to, what I would really like to get out of the conference is learning from other people's experiences of using different science communication platforms. So even like podcasting, like what we're doing right now, something that I don't have a lot of experience with, but I listen to a ton of podcasts and I listen to a ton of public health podcasts. And I just think like it is a really effective way of getting your message to people who aren't necessarily reading academic journals every day. I also like the idea of like writing books, children's books or magazine articles, different types of like communicating your science in ways that are really appealing to people. I find it such a tragedy to do work and then to have it in a closed access academic journal that not even my mom can read because she doesn't have authorization.
I know, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing more depressing than spending all of your time doing a PhD to have your thesis sit in like the library stacks in the basement.
Totally. Yeah.
And we are rolling. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming back. We have another installment of post ComSciCon Canada 2020. And we're back with Sarah Turner. Hello.
Yeah,
Welcome back, and thanks for being here again. It's nice to have you.
great to be back.
Great. So we are, I don't know, a week or two post ComSciCon Canada.
Yeah.
So I am sort of checking in and seeing what you took away, and if you learned anything interesting, or were surprised by anything. Yeah, so I remember when we talked before, we talked a lot about science policy and being interested in that, and we actually had a policy session. How did you like that one?
hmm Yeah, I mean, overall, I loved the conference. I was really impressed with how all of the organizers set up a space that we could really interact in. I wasn't expecting to be able to do that online. And so, in terms of the policy session, I was really happy to see that in the conference, because I feel like it is maybe an area that isn't talked about super often, especially in more like basic science or lab work science. And so it was really nice to see the policy aspect and how all of our science can go on to affect the way that governments enact policies that allow us to access certain things or integrate science into our everyday lives. And so I learned a lot of things. I hadn't really heard of a lot of the networks, or especially none of the student networks. I know we had talked a little bit about it in the first, when we first talked about policy. And I learned that there isn't a ton of student involvement in policy right now. There aren't like individual provincial networks that are established. There's a few across Canada, but there's a lot of room for that, for students to get involved or young scientists to get involved in volunteering or advocating for scientific policies. I think I also took away that it takes quite a bit of work to actually, a lot of persistence, maybe I will say, to get something going and moving through cabinet, and then actually, I guess, developed into an implemented policy. And so there is definitely the political aspect that it's hard to really recognize what that would mean when you're outside of the government. But yeah, getting a little bit more of a taste of how government and science interact, and what's required from people there. So yeah, it was great.
Yeah, that I felt like we didn't have enough time in that one, in that session. It seemed like there were so many different directions that they could have spoke to. Like there was that question about policy work versus advocacy work, and like if there's a difference there. And they kind of went into it a little bit, but all of the different like angles that you can do science policy sort of work. Was that sort of new to you, those different avenues?
I think the distinction between advocacy and policy was something I hadn't really thought of too much. So advocacy being people outside of the government that are advocating for certain things to be implemented, and then people who are inside the government who actually have power to write up policies and push them forward, and how important it is that you're communicating effectively to your audience in that. And so you can write up a really amazing document that has a lot of great information in it, but if the right minister isn't listening, or the right person who has power to do something with it isn't listening, or you don't have their attention, it's not going to get super far. So yeah, I definitely that was insightful to learn about the differences between those two routes.
Yeah. And the panelists that we had seemed like they came from a pretty diverse set of backgrounds. I think two of them, I think, went through the MyTax program. But one of the things that they sort of brought up, and a common question that I assume a lot of students who are interested in this would ask, is do you actually need a PhD to do this policy work, or could you do it out of a master's or something like that? Were you surprised at their answers to that?
So I think the answer was you don't need a PhD to do that work. And what's more important is the experience and the people that you know. I would say I wasn't surprised. I think I know that, like, for sure the people who are in higher up, like scientific advisory positions, those folks have MDs or PhDs and have like a lot of training in science. I think all of the people who were on our panel did have PhDs. So maybe that speaks to the fact that those people or people with PhD training have a different way of communicating, or a different level of knowledge that maybe puts a leg up on the competition maybe. But they definitely, it was a pretty resounding, like, you don't need that degree to get this job, but I think it is helpful. And I think one of the responses for why it was helpful was just being able to gather information is a skill that people really hone in on during their PhDs. And so that's a very important skill for policy briefs, and being able to do things quickly under time pressure and time management. So all of these like auxiliary skills that aren't necessarily about your specific technique for your PhD, but are things that you learn during your program that are useful later on.
Yeah, they made a really good argument for policy work being very similar in structure to like any sort of science communication, in that like you have to, do the groundwork, the research, figure out a way to sort of internalize it and break it down and then present it again, which is basically what we do as PhD students, as researchers, as communicators. It just, at the end, you're giving it to different people, I guess. You're presenting to a different audience.
Yeah, and that's such an important part of SciComm, is know your audience.
Yeah, I feel like almost every panel, that was kind of like something that kept coming up. And that, I mean, makes a lot of sense. We're not doing science communication for ourselves. We're doing it for other people.
Yeah.
Were there any other panels or sessions that really stood out to you that that you enjoyed or found useful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to one on podcasting with Rakeb, and I thought that was a really awesome session. I listen to podcasts often and have been throwing around the idea with my lab for quite a while. We got a really nice mic for our lab meetings because we have several remote people in our lab, and so they often call in. Back when we were all together, we could use this big mic. So we have this mic, and it was kind of a joke in our lab. Well, when are we going to start our podcast? So that was nice because it kind of gets the wheels turning and gives you more information, because it's quite intimidating to think, a big new endeavor with a lot of new technology. But it was broken down really nicely about how it actually, one of the takeaways I got from that session was that audio is a really powerful communication method because it requires participation from the listener to actually visualize and create the images in their mind about what they're hearing. So instead of watching something and having the audio as well as the visual, this takes away one of those things, and so it requires participation from the listener. And so I thought, I've never thought about audio that way. And also just the relatively easy accessibility to actually creating some kind of information through a podcast that you can put out into the world. And I thought that was, it's exciting. It's an exciting possibility for the future.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought that one up. Since there were all those concurrent sessions, that's one of the ones that I didn't end up going to. So I'm glad that I have somebody here on the show to sort of fill me in. Did she go through any sort of like technical type stuff? Like, if you want to get started, go here for resources or anything useful like that?
Yeah, there was a slide that talked about some of the more technical things, like what kind of sound or like audio, like actual mics to use, or what kind of programs you can use for editing. I don't remember the specifics of what she said, but one of the more impactful things that we did during the session was we did breakout groups where we had a story pitched to us, and we had to, or a little blurb, and we had to pitch that story to a particular audience. And so we talked about how in podcasting you can, I mean, it really is about storytelling, and how there's different components to the podcast. You can do, you can do different segments, or you could do an interview or a monologue or something. But kind of this skill of creating kind of a hook or getting your audience engaged in your story. And so we did an exercise where we had to think about the different angles that we could pitch this story depending on the audience that we had.
Oh, cool.
That was cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess if you think about the different styles of podcasts, there's like the just straight up interview ones where it's just people talking, similar to what's going on now. But
Yeah.
then you think of all like the high production radio lab type things that involve little bits of interviews and like long monologue type things.
Yeah.
Did she sort of she talk about like having characters and like having like a sort of like a protagonist, if you will, somebody that like the listener can follow along with? Is that?
We didn't cover that. I think that we just didn't have time. There was like
Right, okay.
more stuff, but actually that was a little bit more related to another workshop that I went to, which was on creative storytelling. So were you at that workshop?
No, I wasn't at that one
You
either.
were at the other one too. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that workshop was really interesting. Basically, we think as scientists, I feel like in my field, the story of the science, we kind of talk about it in like broad terms, but the actual ability to like break down a story and know different components of a story and how to write in this like arc, it just isn't incorporated into scientific literature. That's just not like how publications are set up. And so this is a totally, in my mind, a different way of writing that could be blended, I think, into creating maybe a hybrid type of writing where it's really science-based or really story-based. But yeah, we learned about like the story arc and the different, how you can like talk about different characters. And then we did an exercise where we had to pick a character or pick a story and then tell it from different viewpoints.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was a great session as well. I felt like I learned a lot. I felt like it was a little bit like improv because we had to just make up this story on the spot and then try to tell it from different viewpoints.
It makes a lot of sense that would be difficult for us. Like you were saying how, scientific writing is so not like that. Maybe it should be a little bit more like that. But I find that when I sort of write stuff, it's common for me to just go into science mode where I just assume whoever's reading it is interested and they're along for the ride, and I'll tell you about a thing, and then you get to the end and it's like, and there you have it. But that's not really a good story. That's not really what people want to read. That's just a textbook.
Yeah. So I learned that people, to kind of get people hooked, they want to know the results first. So we always put the results at the end of the paper. But if you're writing for more of a general population audience, or more just even for like a communications perspective, then the results of the story or whatever you have to share, the big impact statement can actually go first, and it doesn't matter if ruining the story or not, like saving the best for last. That's not how good. That's not the form. Okay. So that was interesting, really different way of thinking about writing, and it's for a totally different audience. And another thing I learned about writing was that the active tense is often used in science communication or general public writing, whereas in science writing, we often use the passive tense, which maybe we don't have to because it's more interesting if you're talking about something as like happening right now.
Yeah, that's something that I guess we've always been told. It's like use, past, impersonal, whatever tenses in writing scientific work. But like, why? Why does
Mm-hmm.
it have to be like that? Why can't you just, I don't know, spice it up? Or like all the content is the same and it's presented basically in the same way. Just it's a little bit nicer to read, I think.
Yeah.
Weird.
So I've been writing my thesis proposal and I tried to change some of that to active
Ah,
tense. And it kind of worked, but then there were some sentences where I was like, I don't know how to I don't know how to in the present tense. But yeah, I think it is a good habit or just even something to think about.
yeah. Yeah, if that could be the default, and then if you have to move back into something less engaging or whatever, less
Mm-hmm.
in your face, then you can just sort of do that. Um, how about the write-a-thon? I know we talked about write-a-thon stuff last time. And you weren't in my group, so you had a different expert. Did you
Mm-hmm.
get good feedback there, or how did that go?
Yeah, I thought that was so helpful. So I wrote an op-ed, which I think I talked about in the last, in our last conversation. And so I wrote one on a bit of a different topic and had my experts edit it. And that was one of the big takeaways from writing the op-ed was to write in active tense
Uh,
or present tense instead of passive. Um, and so it was amazing actually how many words you can cut out when you write in the active voice. It really, yeah, it really changes the way that your writing structure is. So yeah, and then also I really enjoyed listening to the other feedback as well for the other
hmm.
people in the group. So that
Was there
was
like a common feedback that you heard, or something that was like particularly standouty that your expert suggested, other than the active voice type suggestions?
so in my group we had two kind of written pieces and then one infographic. Um,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the feedback was different for all of us. Um, yeah, I think like one of the things I remember her saying was it's important to kind of weave your story through everything. So, the paragraphs in your piece, in your written piece, should always feel like there is, I mean, this is kind of just basic writing, but like that there's transitions. You're kind of taking your reader on a journey. And so to think about it from the reader's perspective, but also we talked a lot about just how different writing for like a magazine or a journal is compared to basic science writing. So
Right, right.
flipped. Yeah.
Yeah, in like a journal article, I guess you have all these sections broken up, and a method section can be like almost completely divorced from the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
There can be these hard dividing lines, but I guess you don't really want to do that in a shorter story or an op-ed. Everything needs to be sequential and organized for the person who's reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Any other sort of standouty type stuff that you thought was worth sharing, or?
I really loved using Remo, which was
Okay, yeah.
the form that we used. So I feel like we're going to be doing online conferences for quite a while still, and I'm hoping to encounter more Remo in the future. So it was just very cool to be able to see a floor plan of everyone who was in the room and
Mm-hmm.
kind of jump into tables that if you wanted to talk to someone, you could just hop into their table and see what was going on there. So I really enjoyed that. The networking definitely isn't the same online, but I do think that it was a good compromise for sure. And
Yeah,
talks. I felt like those were So basically these like 1 minute short talks, there people were just told, Kate, talk about your research to this audience, and you're just told the audience in that very session. So I was nervous to do that. I think my audience was 19th century people or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it makes you think on your feet.
Yeah, I guess you really can't assume that they have the same knowledge base as you.
No.
It was interesting to see what people assumed the 19th century person's knowledge base was. Like some people weren't sure if they had germ theory yet exactly,
Yeah.
or where along they were in the
Yeah.
scientific discoveries. That was kind of fun.
What was your audience?
My audience was farmers. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't do anything particularly interesting or funny. I just sort of said the same old that I usually do. It's pretty easy because I just refer to elastic bands and stuff, which everybody knows about. So I didn't really tailor it so much to that audience, but there were some good ones. What was some of the other audiences? There was like a Burning Man attendee.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think an alien.
yeah, that's right. I feel like you could kind of like do something similar for both of those audiences. Yeah, it was a cool exercise. I like that a lot.
Definitely. I really liked it.
Mm-hmm. So now that this is all wrapped up, do you have any sort of like project ideas or any sort of initiatives that you're going to start doing? Has this inspired you to pick up anything?
Yeah. So one of the people who was on the policy panel was the director of Evidence for Democracy, or is the director of Evidence for Democracy. And so they have a lot of volunteer opportunities in different cities. And so I started contacting them and seeing kind of what was available in Winnipeg, or maybe doing something virtually. So that was a nice takeaway point. And then have had a few discussions about podcast ideas and what that could look like and who's on board. There's a few people from my team in the lab who are interested in that. So we'll see. We're talking about, topic areas and what we want to, find our audience, find our niche. So even, just the discussions themselves have been fun to think about because it's creative, interesting. And then, there's going to be a conference for science, well, ComSciConCan, but just the West version. So BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And that will happen in November. And so I'm going to help out a little bit with planning that and kind of advertising it in Manitoba. So
that's cool. Yeah, I saw you guys, the West, sort of starting to plan some stuff.
Yeah, they're on Twitter now.
That's great. It seems like it's so easy for people in the Toronto area like myself. It seems like we have a pretty robust science communication community started up already, but you guys are a lot more distributed.
Mm-hmm.
So
totally. I think there was only one person from Saskatchewan and only myself from Manitoba at the conference. So I was thinking, wow, we need to get more folks in these provinces engaged.
Yeah, that's exciting. There's way more to the West than just, BC or whatever.
It's not just Ontario, the mountains.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to keep our eyes open, and certainly tell me if you get some podcast stuff up and running. I'd love to check it out.
Totally. Yeah, I'll send you the links for the West conference to put in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. Well, thanks so much for being on again. This was great. And yeah, lots of exciting stuff to look forward to. That's awesome.
Totally. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. It was nice seeing you, and have a good rest of your week.
You too. Yeah. Enjoy. Thanks for inviting me, Adam.
Yeah, no problem. All right, bye.
Yeah.
If you like what you heard, head to scientificcanada.ca.